So now we're going to pass it over to our planning committee, who will then make their introductions, starting with Arya.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. Welcome, everyone. I'm Arya Manandar, Women Deliver Young Leader, and I'm currently the advisory group member in Women Deliver. So it's great to have you all. Yeah, I hope the screen is visible now. This workshop session is on exploring the impact of COVID-19 crisis on youth. As Ahmed mentioned, the session will be 35 minutes and we'll have 15 minutes for our discussion and reflection at the end. So never before have we been witness to a pandemic sparked by coronavirus, which is all of our very first time. And when we think about the implications of COVID-19 for a moment, this brings us to the most visible concern, and that is public health. What we'll discuss today would be the social and economic consequences of this pandemic. But not just that, not only it is a public health crisis, but also a crisis that has impacted every sector. So we'll talk about that. As a former UNESCO youth researcher and current youth mentor for Youth as Researcher Sri Lanka team, I'd like to share key policy dialogues with head of states and policymakers, government representatives, and ministers in various high-level policy conferences and key priority commitments and policy solutions that we discussed. So following our global survey, I'd like to share our key findings and recommendations under 5 core themes that are learning, well-being, youth-led action, role of technology, and rights. And it's interesting that 1/4 of the world's population, that is 1.8 billion, the largest cohort of active population in history, are youths of today, who have the greatest potential in decades to come, but yet this group faces the most negative impact of COVID crisis at present. And even before COVID-19 pandemic, this inequality was pre-existing. 267 million young people aged 15 to 24, even prior to the pandemic, were unemployed and lacked education and training, 2/3 of which are young women as a result of gendered expectations of unpaid family work and informal employment. So before we begin, definitely some food for thought for all of us working in public policy, advocacy, and so on is this. Is our research being read by decision makers? Let's assume it's not. Is it worth building it for the sake of memory or learning? Maybe. And can we find better ways to influence decision making? We must, and we will discuss this at the end of the session. So in 2014, World Bank went on a mission to find out how much of their knowledge capital is truly helping solve world's problem. And they found out that over 31% of their policy reports were never downloaded, and almost 87% of their policy reports were never cited. Much of our innovation and research, which may have invaluable solutions to our problems, may be buried in the PDFs. Pre-existing data gaps in these areas concerning the most vulnerable were even more evident during the pandemic. So to gain the data meant our policy recommendations and future debates with heads of states, ministers, policymakers would be evidence-based, the main reason for our research with UNESCO. In our debates with the heads of states and ministers and policymakers, we did receive very great amounts of positive responses to our policy recommendations. But I'd like to highlight the fact that the positive response from decision makers in policy conferences, if not translated into policies and action, cannot really be considered as achieving the goal fully. So until our policy recommendations are translated into real policies followed by required action, our goal, our debate backed by our research data is still not complete. UNESCO is following up with the states on policy recommendations as of now. We'll have to wait and see what will come out of this. Moving on to the next slide. The scale of education crisis created by COVID-19 is well known and has exacerbated existing disparities in accessing quality education. A small hint here, Ahmed might ask you all about this in the post question. So I'd like to highlight this particular fact. 60.5% of the total enrolled learners, more than 1.5 billion worldwide, have been affected by school and university closures. 60.5%. I'm highlighting that just for your reference later. It's a small hint here. And online learning has grown, yet with important differences between regions of the world and within societies. While worldwide, 31% of the total enrolled learners in primary and secondary school were unable to access remote learning. This percentage rises to 49% in Eastern and Southern Africa. From total closure to switching to online classes, students have had numerous challenges to overcome, from internet access and family finances to quality of online teaching. For students approaching graduation, this is very interesting. The transition from education to work is very uncertain, and many students have experienced increased levels of stress and anxiety. Another major issue is access to stable and affordable internet and devices. The majority of the students and about half of the teachers respondents reported having an unstable internet connection. 18.9% students and 24.5% teachers experienced power outages. So this is often followed by an increased class interruptions, such as background noise and being asked for help within the household 2 or 3 times per week in average. Female respondents also noted having difficulty concentrating at home due to increased household tasks. So these were summary of the key challenges that we found in learning. And I'd like to move on quickly to the recommendations that we put forward to the heads of state. Moving on to our recommendations, it stresses on affordable and reliable online access to learning through loan schemes, financial subsidies, and equipment banks, particularly benefiting young women, low-income and vulnerable students, on upskilling students and teachers, hybrid and alternative education, developing student support systems, strengthening cooperation and international organizations, supporting students with tools needed to join in the online classes, for example, tablets, laptops, particularly in the countries of ongoing conflict. So maybe we can come back to this slide later because we have time constraint. I'd like to move on to another theme that we worked on, which is well-being. We found significant changes in mental health status in global study with 400,000 participants. Psychological distress was the most widely reported, affecting 50% of our participants. Seclusion, lack of contact with peers, and for many, the loss of emotional and financial security disrupted not only their daily lives, that is their education also, but also proper overall development. We found an increased risk of suffering from depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, as well as an increase in the rates of youth suicide as they were unable to cope with the various stresses. Our data from 171 countries suggests that there has been a global shortfall in investment in mental health, needing a scale-up of quality mental health services that is aligned with needs. These are our recommendations. These are few of our many recommendations that we proposed. So often intimately linked with young people's studies and work lives, both of which have undergone abrupt and significant disruptions. Well-being, particularly mental well-being, was a key concern in all the regions. Critical concerns of the researchers included access to mental health services, quality of these services, and given the restrictions in place and stigma experienced by the residents. Another theme that we researched on was youth-led action. We can see in South Asia, 73.5% of youths participated in youth-led action in combating COVID-19 pandemic. And in Brazil, it was 65%. A silver lining in pandemic has been the way young people have been providing their resilience, inventiveness, and innovation in the face of adversity. According to our global study, 31% youth volunteered and 27 made donations toward pandemic response. So youth changed the way they approach civic action through innovation and adaptation, especially in digital engagement. A number of storytelling communication initiatives throughout the pandemic have been showcasing how young people have been engaging online and on-site to provide responses to various challenges, much of which was directly aimed at spreading awareness about COVID-19 and supporting the community safety through provision of protective gear and relief materials. Let's move on to our recommendations. So these are our key recommendations. I would not like to go through each and every one because we have very limited time, but all these recommendations I'd like to highlight are based on the condition of young volunteers, that is unpaid volunteer work, increased risk of exposure to virus, and how youth groups have no safety, security, insurance, or remuneration, lack of economic stability of young people, and young people dealing with trauma. So improving support to youth-led initiatives, recognition of youth-led initiatives, enhancing avenues for young people to connect, network, and partner with policymakers, government, and funding agencies and relevant partners. Also creating safer spaces and all-inclusive policies for youth volunteerism and providing psychosocial counseling and psychosocial interventions for youth volunteers dealing with trauma were a few of many recommendations. I am not going through each and every recommendation because this is just an idea of what we recommended to the policymakers. Our idea is to discuss at the end about all the policies that we would want the policymakers to implement and what ideas we have, how would we want it to be implemented, and so on. Online learning and social distancing requirements increase reliance on digital media for most aspects of the lives of youth, with research suggesting a net increase in screen time among youth during pandemic. And although young people tend to be proficient in technology, important gaps in capacity, access, and expectations for youth regarding technology were revealed. Recent research has revealed the association between pandemic-related stresses and psychopathology. Young people, often with lower skills and less experience, were found in the first to have their livelihoods impacted. Another grave issue is intersectionality of gender and youth, particularly the gendered impact on the right to work during the pandemic is not sufficiently explored. For greater than 75% youth, the delayed SRHR cases were related to abortion care, antenatal, childbirth, and postnatal care, and even contraception. More than 50% of the respondents experienced delays with accessing treatment and medication for human immunodeficiency virus, which is HIV, and sexually transmitted infections, STIs, during the pandemic, and as well as the prevention and management of reproductive cancers. We also found severe impact on women's right to work. To find out more on our recommendation on the themes mentioned above, please visit UNESCO's official site to download our Global Policy Dialogue, which is again a PDF document. We can come back to this slide to discuss examples and data from North America and Pakistan, particularly on the impact of women's right to work, because we have few data which are quite interesting. It also contrasts each other, and it represents a lot of women in these countries who have similar backgrounds, and yet they are in different situations and are differently impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we can come back to this slide to discuss further. These are our Global 10 recommendations, which are the main recommendations apart from the theme-based recommendations. So these were the recommendations we also addressed to the heads of state, government, and other ministers. So if there are any questions, I'd like you to just write it in the chat box. If there are no questions on these slides, we can move on to our discussion phase.
Freya, there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Hafsa has asked, do we have an update on how many recommendations were adapted by the states and any accountability measure to follow up on it? How was the data collected and what regions did the data sources come from? This is a very nice question, Hafsa, because this is one of the crucial issues that we are tackling today. We collect data, we conduct our researches, and our data remain buried in the PDFs, as already mentioned, as already shared in the World Bank bar graph. Our research was conducted by global teams and regional teams. So it was all over the world. 270 young researchers participated in this Youth Researcher Initiative. And there were global teams which researched on global thematic issues, and regional teams further researched on the areas related to their region. And we have a lot of data and researches, and this PDF document is a combined version of all of it. All the regions that are there were involved. All the teams from different countries were involved. We also had global teams, so we have diverse data. But when it comes to the adaptation and implementation of the data, I think we are stuck there. UNESCO has built up a support system for all the young researchers' policy recommendations to be followed up with Minister of Chad, Minister of Mexico. And as we had dialogues with the ministers and heads of state, even we were very curious about the implementation phase. So we are trying to follow up with the states on the implementation process. And I think that is a great challenge for all of us, because our data, our research, and our evidence-based policy recommendations are not yet complete when it comes to implementation. And that is actually holding us back. So we are following up with UNESCO, and UNESCO is following up with the nations. And I think I'm quite positive about it, but I'm also skeptical about it. I know we all have the same questions regarding our research and data. Yes, South Asia and Southeast Asia were also considered. We had South Asia team. I was part of the South Asia regional team, and East Asia had a team too. But all of these regions were also considered and included in the global team research. Yeah, we do have research data from Pakistan as well. So we could discuss that later. I'll share the PDF with Elizabeth to share it with all of you after the session. Okay, then I think if there are any questions, you can put it in the chat box. Okay, then I'd like to move on to the main part of my session. Now I'd like to hear from you on any relevant policy action, effective policy recommendation, or policy blocking to protect the most vulnerable groups in our society, community, and countries. Or if you could just share with us any data gaps that you came across on areas such as gender-based violence, double labor, unpaid labor, impacted by COVID-19, and the lack of research in low and middle income countries. If there is anyone who'd like to share their observation on these, or if there is anyone who is part of any policy action or policy recommendation, I'd love to hear from them so that we can continue our discussion. The floor is also open for a brief discussion on any of our research, analysis, or evidence-based and inclusive policy recommendations or blocking in this region. For example, it can also be a significant example in any policy changes in each of our countries. Well, there was a regressive policy recommendation, a travel ban proposed by the Nepal Immigration Department following COVID-19 pandemic, restricting women migrant workers under 40 to travel abroad for work until they are able to provide family permission and family consent, and also a permission from local ward. So this policy was successfully blocked. I think Bonita and Pooja, all joining in from Nepal, are aware about this restrictive policy recommendation from Nepal Immigration Department that was very regressive for women migrant workers aged under 40. So I think we also have a lot of other young leaders who would want to share such kind of observation or incident or their experience.
Yeah, I can maybe share a bit if that's okay.
Hi, Fai.
Hi, everyone. I'm Faye. I'm from Indonesia. I work primarily in anti-trafficking, counter-trafficking strike. I work primarily in counter-trafficking in Indonesia. So we work with victims of child prostitution and sex trafficking, labor trafficking, as well as labor exploitation. And throughout the COVID-19, we saw a triple in cases that we handled. So what before we had been handling around 30 cases a year, we suddenly got 100 cases a year starting in the beginning of COVID-19. That was due to a lot of different factors, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So there was economic issues. There was just a lack of proper government implementation of what they could have done to stop it, really. And what accompanied the increase in number of cases was also the decrease of capacity for government institutions and agencies to handle these cases of labor exploitation and of they not only didn't have enough resources, they didn't have enough personnel, they didn't have enough training, and worst of all, the corruption was even worse. And I think maybe my friends in other countries here can relate to that specific point, that there was just really bad corruption on all levels. But I think what was the most heartbreaking part is, like, I could name right now like 10 to 15 police officers that we work with who are corrupt, who have taken money from the people who traffic kids in the regions that we work in. But it's also kind of like a systematic issue, right? This is petty level corruption. And so as much as there have been policies passed in Indonesia, such as Undang-Undang Pencegahan Kekerasan Seksual, which was the anti-sexual assault and anti-sexual harassment bill, it's quite a progressive, I want to say, development in Indonesian policy. That said, there's little implementation. COVID times is like almost the worst time for it to pass because there has been minimal training, minimal focus on it. And even if it's passed, Indonesia is so big that the implementation is probably limited to Jakarta if implemented at all. So I guess I think the key, I want to say, findings that our organization has gotten and discovered throughout the pandemic was just all the nooks and crannies of the system where victims fall through, specifically because a lot of children in Indonesia aren't documented. They don't have birth certificates, and that means that they're not technically Indonesian nationals, if that makes sense. So then, like, it's legal, right, for Indonesian, we call it puskesmas, pusat kesehatan masyarakat, or like community health centers. They can, like, I don't know the English word, but they can like raise their hands and say, oh, this isn't our responsibility. And so part of the work isn't just kind of giving the kids counseling and giving them kids like rehab, like medical aid and legal aid, but also getting them the documents they need so that they can get the aid they need. So I think maybe that's what I can share. I hope that wasn't too all over the place.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's quite interesting that the situation is similar in developing countries, especially in Nepal, because the policy that was supposed to protect the women under age 40 is actually regressive because it brings us back to square one. Earlier, I think 30 years back, I heard from AMCA's chairperson, Vijay Rai Shrestha, who's actually working for the women migrant worker returnees in Nepal. She mentioned that she was supposed to go to work abroad and, send money back to her family in Nepal, but she was not allowed to do so. And she had to take permission from her family, as she was the eldest in the family and she had no parents. She had to take consent letter from a 14-year-old brother who was actually 10 years younger than her. It's quite sad that, the idea of regressive policy is young women migrant workers, but at the same time, they try to restrict women in a way that it's very regressive. It brings us back to that era, and it's very depressing and sad that we've gone back to that era. And thankfully, the policy is blocked. As you said, there are many systematic errors and systematic corruption involved, like police officers. There are a lot of people who are middlemen who are actually taking the women migrant workers illegally to work. So any which way, the migrant workers will find a way to work, but we need to regulate the market and we need to make them able enough to take decisions for themselves. It was quite sad that pandemic exacerbated these inequalities, even in Nepal and even in different areas of our region. And thank you so much for sharing that. If there is anyone who'd like to share any observation, I'd love to hear your input.
Yeah, we have time for one other input as well, if anyone is willing to.
I just want to highlight there's a lot that's also coming through the chat as well, Arya. I think a lot of people are also engaging through the chat.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing. Thank you, Elizabeth. I can see Mark's input. And Mark says the provision of ARVs among PL-HIV during peak of COVID-19 was a great challenge. Yes, it was, because SRHR facilities, clinics, the closure of all of it has impacted youth greatly, given the fact that youth have been a group that has been disproportionately impacted by any crisis, not just COVID crisis, but climate crisis and all of that. And Mark says one requirement that time before you can travel to next municipality or city is to show a health pass and disclosure information why you have to go there. Many of the PL-HIVs I know had to disclose their status to the police who were guarding the checkup points. So Mark says it would be great to research about this, as I'm sure there are also other protocols in different countries. Definitely. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your input. FI has added that it wasn't just the number of cases that went up, the depravity as well. When the youngest case we had received before 2019 was a 13-year-old girl. After COVID began, we took in 3 cases of children under age 5. Oh, that's that. Thank you so much for sharing, FI.
So I can share like some thoughts around like access to abortion. That has been a huge issue in Bhutan itself, because before the pandemic, like folks, like regardless of how the law were, like folks, because of the open border, like folks were able to like get access to those healthcare services. But unfortunately, once the lockdown started, like there was a huge issue on having access to those healthcare. And during that time, like we tried like working with the local government, but they were like, still like trying to be like, oh, there's like more important things to do. But again, like, it's something important and something that would be helpful. And also the other area is also about the rate of like domestic violence, like, especially with LGBT folks. I'm not sure if folks are aware, like especially in the Asia Pacific region, we have like recently started like working on domestic violence, but looking into like more into like LGBT communities and how like the state violence and also how the police violence, also like family and like the community itself has a huge impact on those. But my thoughts and question is mostly about like how we are like making sure that folks who are often like marginalized, like come from various groups, like are being incorporated in this like data identity, and also like how we are making these data accessible, because like for folks like who are able to go to online or who have access to technology, they're able to take this quizzes or like surveys from themselves. But how about like like reaching out to like folks who are in in rural areas, or like who doesn't have access to these resources. So I think like these are like good questions to think through, like while while we talk about these issues, and also like while we try to leave no one behind at the same time. But just wanted to share those two thoughts with everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Atish, and for also bringing up LGBTQI plus rights in Asia Pacific. And it's very interesting that you pointed out, youths are not homogeneous group. Even if we refer to it as a youth group, I think we all have our different intersectional identities. We have our different privileges, prejudices, and we are intersectional in our identities overall. May it be our background, race, gender, different things. So the impact of crisis has always been in the history very disproportionate, and especially the youths who are from low middle income countries who have different intersectional identities. For example, youths from rural areas, LGBTQI+, and youths who are actually suffering because of economic instability, youths who are suffering because of SR-HR closure, all of them are impacted differently. And it's very essential for us to research and advocate against all these inequalities, because it's not just one inequality. We all fall under the overlapping of one or more inequalities. And when we get the seat, I think we need to advocate for those who actually have prejudices and could not make it in that place or that seat. So I think in youth group, even if we are intersectional, what we can do is when we get the seat, we can at least speak up for other people who are not actually in the seat yet. So thank you, Atish, for mentioning that. That is it is that we are always considered a homogeneous group. And also in policy making, I feel youth policies are being made without youths being in the table for their own policies, for their own good. They're not being involved in the decision making and policy making. So thank you so much.
Sorry to cut in, but we are actually short in time. So I would really like to say that, wow, it was an insightful and productive discussion. And I personally learned a lot of useful information for my own advocacy work. Also, Arya, if you could share your email in the chat box so that young leaders can contact you in the future if they have any queries or if they just want to reach out. So if you would like to just share your email in the chat box.
Yeah, Arya, if you consent to that, it looks like, there's a lot of engagement around your topic. It's such a great topic. And so if you're okay with, young leaders being able to also reach out to you as well, we'll of course share your presentation in the follow-up email that goes out to everyone. But, happy to, if you consent to also then share your email as well.
Thank you, everyone, for all of your inputs, and apologies that I had to skip all the slide because there were a lot of data. I didn't want to take the other session's time, so I had to quickly skip all the data. But thank you so much for your inputs, and I'm willing to learn more from you all and through other engagements and what we can do next. And maybe we'll see each other in Kigali. And before that, we'll have a lot of other initiatives that we might have collaborated or discussed about. So thank you so much for all your inputs. I hope you finished your post quiz. So over to Ahmed.
Thank you so much. I mean, really, the presentation was so engaging, and just look at the chat box, so many positive feedback. And thanks to all of you for taking the post test. And I hope that you have enjoyed the session as much as I did, or even more.